Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Practically Platonic. My name is Jeffrey, and I'm talking to my good friend Silvia today. Hi, Silvia.
Hey there, how you doing?
Good. So we're going to be discussing the following chapter 1.4 on happiness by Plotinus. So just to jump right in, before you read this chapter, I'd like to ask, how do you understand happiness?
Um, I guess something that, even though I don't think I had a good definition of it, I knew it was something that should be sustainable. Unlike the kind of happiness some people think of that are more tied to like states of joy or ecstasy
Right.
or event driven hormonal things. I guess I associate it more closely with just more than defining it, just another word like serenity, a state of
Mm-hmm.
serenity, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But definitely an idea that I think eludes most people, which is why it's been such a major topic, I think, throughout time.
Right, right. I mean, I've read more Stoicism than Platonic thought at present, and I'm more familiar with the Stoic idea of happiness, which is the English translation of eudaimonia, which in modern English I think might be better translated as mental stability, mental wellness, because I think especially in the modern English-speaking world, happiness has a particular popular meaning that lacks the philosophical nuance that is normally assigned to it in the study of philosophy. I mean, obviously that would be the case, but a lot of people talk about happiness now and pursuing happiness, the pursuit of happiness. And my perception is that today happiness is often understood as a state of perpetual joy, of excitement, that there's a sort of perpetual thrill, and that the absence of this is treated as anomalous, that it's treated as somehow a deficiency that needs to be corrected, almost like it's treated as an illness. And so a lot of people will make life-changing decisions in order to pursue happiness. They'll, for example, get into or out of a relationship, they'll change careers, they'll pursue a career in pursuit of this concept of happiness. And particularly in today's world, where a lot of people are blessed with long-term good fortune as far as material and physical health go, and still the question of happiness is still, widely discussed and pursued, but it's not really defined in a very um, sophisticated way, I think. So it's quite refreshing and interesting to read Plotinus's ideas on happiness. And so he was also discussing happiness relative to um, the Aristotelian school, the Epicureans, and the Stoics. And so in this chapter, as we read, for example, Aristotle suggests that this good life, happiness, is the achievement of some function. And so Plotinus goes into this idea, proposed idea, that non-rational animals and plants can also be happy. And he also discusses the Epicurean position that connects happiness with pleasure, the pleasant life. And then there's the Stoic position, which is better, according to him. Um, but the problem with that is that according to him, is that rationality has its limitations as well. So, in his view, that this happy life, happiness, is really only realistically achieved through having a life that is identified with the good, the one. And so this builds upon the earlier chapters on virtue and wisdom. And one of the big takeaways that I got from this chapter is this one line where he explicitly states, being happy resides in the actualization of wisdom. And so it is wisdom that leads to happiness. It's not necessarily, or it's explicitly not, the pursuit of pleasure or the achievement of some sort of like biological function or reliance on rationality. And so we're building on the earlier cosmology, on the theory of virtue, the theory of ideas, and now we come to this idea that you can be happy by achieving wisdom and through not only understanding and drawing yourself towards the good, but also identifying with it. That's my take on it. So what's your take on this chapter as a general summary?
I think you've pretty much summarized the overall points. I'd like to go back and point out not point out anything wrong that you said, but like add some detail to some of the things that you quickly went over. So as you've already stated, practically this chapter is about what he believes true happiness is. And he starts off with kind of very briefly debating, or rather arguing, the different positions put by these different schools of thought of the time, and that still exist. And as you were going kind of briefly through all of them, the thing that stood out to me is that the main difference on Plotinus's idea of happiness and these other schools is that theirs, at least as I'm interpreting it, still resides in the material world, versus his, where the definition of happiness is something sublime, in the sense of something outside of time, outside of the material, in the intelligible realm. And so I wanted to very quickly just go over, make that connection with the different ideas. Aristotle, so he doesn't give much weight to Aristotle's idea. I personally actually kind of had a second comment, at least based on what he said here. Now, I'm not very familiar with the entirety of Aristotle's ideas on happiness, but I do think that aspects of Aristotle's idea of functionality kind of can be a subsection of the wider idea of happiness, because he thinks that it's if insofar as an entity fulfills its function, it is happy. But if our true function in life is to be aware and reconnected with the one, or with the intelligible realm, and every other being insofar as they can, or whatever Plotinus believes is the true harmonious nature of animals and plants and such, then indeed would not Aristotle be correct on some level? Maybe the difference, I think, is that Aristotle's definition of function remains very low, metaphysical, like in the realm of natural sciences. And one other thing I wanted to add, which kind of to add to Plotinus's argument, which he was not aware of at the time, because it was Aristotle, right, that says that, plants can't be happy because they have no sense perception.
Mm-hmm.
Well, since then, we have now found out that indeed plants do have sense perception. They don't have, the senses we have, but plants are actually able to communicate with each other. They are actually able to sense something that it would be akin to, not pain as we know it, but things that can indicate to them that there is a threat. They can indicate that indicates changes in the soil, in the environment. Plants communicate, as I already said, communicate between each other. There's been plenty of studies showing that they are influenced by vibrations, by sound.
Mm-hmm.
So even on that level, I think Aristotle is incorrect. But as far as if we elevate the concept of function, I think you could marry his idea under the wider idea of Plotinus's happiness. As far as the Stoics, a point that he made about rationality or reason as they define it, it wasn't so much that he had an issue with reason, but the way that, as I understood, Plotinus defines reason is the intelligible realm, right? Because he also says that perfection of reason is virtue.
Right.
To him, true reason is in the intelligible realm. So that does go toward happiness, but he's making the argument, at least from, his point of view, that the problem with the Stoics is like, okay, you're saying that reason is the utmost, but why? Who cares? You can get to the same, if you're rational, you can do X, Y, and Z better. But look at animals, look at other people that are less rational. They can still get to that place in the same manner. And if the only purpose of reason is for these kind of mundane material gains, and it is not because you believe in a higher meaning or a higher idea of reason, then it's kind of pointless. I think he takes argument with their materialistic view on the concept of reason. And if reason for them was elevated, he would probably agree with them. But he thinks, I think from today's point of view, we might say that at least in this aspect, he sees them as kind of like atheistic, materialistic about the concept of rationality, and therefore, missing the mark. And then Epicureanism, it's pretty easy to understand why he would not agree with it. And I wanted to add one more thing about, maybe I'll talk about it now. As you were talking about, like in like the zeit, or just in popular culture, or how people in general tend to think of happiness, especially in today's world, as this continued chase for certain levels of thrills or whatever. Definitely, one could easily argue that what they're actually just chasing is extremely material, because they're just chasing the idea that you could consistently hold on to a certain level of endorphin high and stay there. There was various studies done, which Huberman covered on his podcast, in talking about fulfilling goal. The topic was like fulfilling goals and maintaining a level of happiness in a sense. And he was talking about the importance of discipline. Now, it's not quite correlated with this, but even in the material aspect of a lower happiness, constant states of endorphin are unsustainable and actually detrimental. He was saying that as you move forward, trying to fulfill a goal, like maybe an academic thing or something, you should not even you need to like set up a reward system to keep you focused and going toward that goal. But those people who, for every little thing they do, they choose to reward themselves some way to get that endorphin high, very quickly, that will stop working. And it will also lower your focus and your discipline and your intent on reaching that goal. So this whole idea of constantly actually seeking things that even on a lower level make us happy are detrimental, because they slowly make us actually less happy, because humans are not supposed to be constantly rewarded for every small thing. Only large achievements should be large, and like, other like market achievements should be rewarded. So definitely this idea in modernity that it's just unrealistic, even from a physiological point of view. And all that they're chasing is not true happiness, but just a physiological state. And often they remain unhappy because it is lacking in any sort of higher meaning. There's nothing from the intelligible realm. It's just like people are like, oh, I have all these things, I have this wonderful life, but I feel empty.
Right. I mean, that's one of the big questions, is why is it that people who live in affluent societies with a great deal of luxuries, especially like unprecedented levels of luxury and comfort that our predecessors did not have, such as, for example, 24-hour air conditioning, heating, food on demand, healthcare, painkillers. I mean, if you live in an industrialized society now, and provided you're not poor, you have access to unprecedented levels of comfort. But yet people are
Plotinus
still
talks about that. He actually answers this exact question in this chapter, because he says that goodness and happiness isn't something where you add things to life, but is intrinsic to life. He says that, he gives us an example, when people, not that if you're happy, you're happy, but like being in good health and pain-free, people aren't happy. They just kind of take that for granted.
Mm-hmm.
And when they are in pain and suffering and unhealthy, they lament and say, oh, if only I was healthy, I would be happy. But really, it's just because they're in a state of suffering and they want to be rid of that. But when they are in the opposite state, the state of health itself does not actually make people happy, for example. And you can extend that to other comforts and other luxuries. He says, yeah, health and a lack of pain are not happiness, because when we are healthy, we take it for granted. I'm not quoting directly, and might not be happy. And same for lack of pain. But when we have pain, we want health, but it isn't the good itself. The happy person still wishes to continue to be in good health, or if they are in pain, to not be in pain, but not because they think that will make them happy, but simply for the correct sustainment of their embodied self, for the body in which they're inhabiting. And he talks about that as well, about, doesn't mean that just because someone is in a state of true happiness, they're just like, like wasting away and don't care about anything at all. They're still like, part of reason is also the rationality of maintenance of the self, of that aspect of the self.
Right. I mean, it's a natural expression of a healthy and sound mind to take care of your physical form, because your present existence depends upon it. And like he makes the analogy at the end of the chapter between the musician. So the musician plays the lyre, and eventually the musician might have to give up the lyre when its function or its utility has been extinguished. And I mean, what he's saying is that you maintain, I think you could say based on that, you maintain your form until its utility has extinguished, which means that until your expiration date comes, then it is in your best interest and it's most reasonable to take care of your physical form, not just waste away or to turn towards something like hedonism. And as he says also, he says that, wisdom leads to virtue. So it's also probably a natural expression of that, is that you'll take care of yourself. I mean, I see a lot of parallels with Stoicism too, where the Stoics feel that if you are not subject to the pathos, then you're just naturally going to act in a very sort of rational, but not cold and calculated way. In fact, you'll actually be quite affectionate and loving with other people. And that's what Plotinus is also suggesting as well, is that if you're a wise person with virtue, then you'll also be caring for other people as well, because in the absence of, irrational thoughts and feelings, and, to use the Stoic term, pathos, then you're just all that more generous with people and considerate, and also toward yourself as well. I mean, I sense one of the biggest differences, as you already pointed out, between the Stoics and Plotinus is the cosmology. So the Stoics are materialist, and Plotinus is very much not materialist. And so the Stoics would say that eudaimonia, happiness, is acceptance of an immutable fate. So willing all things that you experience external to your mind, because you have no control over them. You have no control over everything external to the mind, external to the will. So you can either accept it and go along with the flow, or get dragged along kicking and screaming. So from a Stoic point of view, there's no recourse, there's no need to consider the soul, the intellect, the one, because for them, material reality is sufficient. And in their perspective, they're not considering this higher metaphysical reality. I don't think the methodologies are entirely incompatible, but it's just that cosmologically they're very different.
Well, I think he also differs on the concept of us having no control, or he definitely believes that there is will. He says it specifically in this chapter, that will is what is up to us, not the bodily reaction, and we can use will to get to what the soul desires, which is better than itself. And I wanted to point out, and also I think, based on what we've been talking about, that just because, happiness is this other thing doesn't mean we shouldn't take care of our bodies, etc. I think that's like a very important point that maybe a lot of people miss, that at least in this sense, happiness is being able to reach this higher state that is atemporal.
Hmm.
But I think most people, or a lot of different philosophies, seem to say that everything you do in life should be in the pursuit of happiness. But he says we should do all sorts of things that are not in the pursuit of happiness. That the reason you do things in life should not be, I mean, they should be, once you've reached a certain level, or you're at least virtuous, then necessarily you will also do things that are probably correct, but, or, are virtuous. I guess that's redundant, but he's not saying do all these things so you become happy. He actually says that at a certain point. He says, virtue does not make happiness. And this is not a direct quote again, but paraphrase, basically, the virtuous person, or doing virtuous things, does not make one happy. It is someone that is already happy that does virtuous
Right.
things, which is so telling of a lot of things in society, I think. But he also says, the happy person still wishes for, the other people in his life. Or was I reading? He said something to the effect of, don't be avoidant of the problems of life or the negative events that occur to those we care about. So he's not saying, once you reach happiness, you just zen out and like aren't part of society, or act like a material being on some level. Rather, ready yourself to confront them, the issues in life, without it affecting your soul. If it is virtuous, if your soul is virtuous, much like the truly happy person remains such, knowing bad things happen in life. And he gives all these like pretty crazy examples about like a king or a ruler, if his wife and his daughters are all taken away and raped. But if he is truly virtuous and in a state of happiness, he will remain happy. Obviously, this is very hard probably for most of us to wrap our mind around. But I don't think he's saying that that king then should not probably try to, go out and regain his wife and daughters. He's just saying that if you reach a certain level, and even before the event, he says, and which is very important for people, I think, dealing with anxiety, for example. He says that the happy person remains happy, even contemplating future events that could be horrible, right? All these terrible things can happen, and they just understand that that's just part of the nature of reality in the material world. Good and bad things happen, and that they themselves should not be the influence or the reason for which one is happy or unhappy.
Right.
So that there's like these two different rails. They should not be the same. They are related, right? Because if you are happy, you then also act beautifully and virtuously, and therefore you're in your interactions with the material world and others, you will do things that are, ethically more correct within the dynamics we've been talking about. But the things you do themselves are not related to being happy. They are not the cause. At best, it is the other way around, is what I've also taken away from this. So this whole like dynamic of like, if I do more of this, if I do more of that, if I do this, I will achieve happiness. No, it's this whole other separate thing, which he kind of gets into a little bit. It's really more of like a mental state that it's kind of hard to. Do you have any input on how he kind of describes getting into a state of happiness?
Well, yeah, it's basically turning away from the mundane world as a condition for your mental well-being. And the idea is that if you if your soul turns toward the good, the one, and so by extension, the intellect, then you will be less emotionally compelled by the vicissitudes and fortunes of material reality. And so I think this is also connected to his earlier comments on beauty and form. So the common person sees beauty and repulsiveness, and so that which is ugly they are repelled by, and that which is beauty they are drawn to. But then if you understand this from a higher perspective, then you turn toward the intellect, and
Mm-hmm.
you have the idea of beauty and also the idea of ugliness. And the more you understand this, the more you are detached from material reality as a sort of compulsive state. So I think in this sense that the more you turn away from material reality and look towards the forms, the less you will be driven by their mundane expressions in material reality. And if you position your mental state, the conditions for your happiness, on something that is immutable, absolute, and ultimate, and by extension outside of time, then that also means that your sense of happiness is unbreakable, indestructible. And it's basically at a metaphysical level, it's no longer conditional upon not just physical reality, but also your perceptions of physical reality. I mean, there's a lot of abstractions as well within reality that people position their happiness on as a condition. Like, for example, reputation. And Plotinus talks about this as well. Like, well, what if you are disgraced? What if you have, lost your glory, your reputation, even social status? I mean, social status is an abstraction. It's not like a physical entity that you can hold in your hand and put in your pocket. Nevertheless, I mean, social status, the loss of it, the gain of it affects us in a mundane sense. Normally, it goes back and forth, right? Whereas if your happiness is effectively oriented towards the good, the one, then you are basically immune to the vicissitudes and turmoil of reality. And then from that, if you're in this state of mind perpetually, then you'll also act in a good way and in a reasonable way. I think if you, as you pointed out, like, I think if you were in a position of authority and you were, and you understood this very well and you had accepted it, then you would have to do things that might require a certain level of aggression and violence. Like if you're a king in a battle, in a war, defending your people, then you have to do certain things, but you won't be doing this out of vengeance or hatred or great anger, but you'll be doing it because it's the reasonable, rational thing to do, because you're
Right.
defending your people. I can imagine some Roman generals maybe having these sort of ideas as well and subjugating barbarian peoples, thinking it's for the good of not just Rome, but basically establishing order in a chaotic world. So that's a whole other discussion onto itself. But we know that in antiquity that a lot of people studied, not just Plato, but the Stoics as well, who had similar ideas as well, that you can be freed from the passions of the mind and not be so deeply oriented and enmeshed in material reality, but you still have to lead a life. And in fact, you're morally obligated as well to react to circumstances, but in a way that would be different from somebody who's just automatically reacting to things in a very instinctual, base manner. That's my kind of takeaway from all of this.
Yeah, and where you kind of started, where you went back to his contemplation of the forms and basically the use of reason and intellect to grasp those things in the intelligible sphere. He actually speaks to that. There is a part where he kind of directly defines it in section 1.4.3. I mean, the entire section, but at line 25, if then living well, he talks about like if happiness is living well, he says living well belongs to something living fully, meaning something that is in no way deficient in life. Being happy will belong only to one living fully, for the best will belong to this. And he says for human beings, I assume he's just talking about human beings, but maybe this extent, for human beings. A human being has a perfect life because which I'm taking to mean, was living fully, therefore happy, therefore has a perfect life because it has the faculty of calculating, reasoning, and genuine intellect. So the ability of calculative reasoning and genuine intellect are those necessary things to be able to ponder and start grasping things at the higher realm of the soul and the intelligible world. He also says, which I think is interesting, he is not a human being if he does not have, or at least attempt these, if he does not have, or at least have the potency of these aspects. He can't which is kind of interesting, right? And we do, in the sense that when people aren't able to use reason or calculative intellect and act completely emotionally, I mean, we've always said, like, this person is like not even acting like a person anymore. They're acting like a beast. So he's bringing back those very things that I think perhaps the Stoics and modernity think of calculative reasoning and the intellect as these things that only exist cerebrally and in this material world. And that those are like the main, what's the word I'm looking for? The main marks of humanity. He agrees to that, but he's like, no, it doesn't just end here. That is what living fully as a human is. But those things are tied to a much higher metaphysical realm, which I think ties back to what you were saying. And if you realize that, then you're really being you're fully human. And I think it ties back to Aristotle's idea of functionality. You are fulfilling truly the function of being a human, which is using your intellectual capacities to connect with or ponder these higher realms from whence everything came. And he also says, to achieve happiness, therefore, one has transformed himself to be identical with these things. So those things that you can grasp or those things that you can grasp, I guess he thinks you can grasp them. If he thinks you can become identical with them, that you can grasp through intellect.
Right. Well, I mean, fundamentally, we are expressions of the forms.
Right.
You can't even say we're the same or different because we're really
correct. And he says, yeah, I think he says that in this chapter.
Right. But the problem is actually understanding that and also fully realizing it and going also through the implications of that. And I suppose using his words, assimilating. So there is a process where you are ignorant of this and that there's a gradual process of assimilation.
I think it goes back to the previous chapter we discussed because, okay, so what can I do with my genuine intellect and my calculative reasoning? You can go back to the model that he set up with the musician, lover, and philosopher. At the end of the day, what one does with these things is is the pursuit of wisdom. All the mathematical wisdom, dialectical wisdom. I mean, those are kind of like baseline, fundamental, large categories of wisdom and knowledge. And I think it is through that. And at that point, you know, you're learning for the sake of wisdom. You're not learning because you think it's going to or you go on that path, not because it's going to help you find the right partner. I mean, it might indirectly, but it's not why you're doing it. It might facilitate some of this, but it's not why you're doing it. It's not to find the right partner in life. It's not to get a better paying job. It's not going to pay your mortgage. It's not going to make you or it's not because it's going to make you healthier. It is for the pure joy of wisdom, right? So again, delineating, like, you still have to take care of all this other stuff in life, but that's not what's going to make you happy. That is just the nature of being a mortal being on this, an embodied mortal being.
Right.
This is where you're happy.
And it's nothing to reject either. It's just part of.
So there is actually there is a place to start for people who are like, okay, what if I really like learning? It's really, that's what it comes down to. The pursuit of learning, and this is Silvia speaking, just, it seems like it's the pursuit of learning and the joy of learning without any sort of like secondary reason for which you're doing it, not to specifically, you know, back up preconceived ideas you have of the world, not to try to position yourself better in the eyes of others, not simply to better yourself in a, say, academic or career position, but simply for the joy of knowing more. And if you go on that journey of knowledge in whatever field or multiple fields, I think once you go on that journey and that relationship with the impressions of the intelligible realm that you will come into contact with will help you get moving forward toward what he says is the end goal here. And that is, I think, an actual actionable step that anybody can take if they wish to. That is
Right.
not an abstraction. It's an actual thing you can do. And once you're on that journey, some of the stuff becomes more understandable in ways that sometimes are hard to put into words because they are so abstract.
Right. This reminds me of a later work, the Gayat al-Hakim, which was translated as Picatrix in the 13th century into Latin. And there's a line from that which I've adopted as my mantra: Nam studere servere Deo est. So to study is to serve God. And the author,
I like that.
the author of the Picatrix also says that one of the aspects of virtue, or not of wisdom, is that it only increases and doesn't decrease, and that it only increases if the learner wills it. So the idea is that, especially in this context, because it's an occult context, is that there's a diverse array of things that you learn, from botany to alchemy, astrology, mathematics. And it's the whole process of learning all these things, but also with this perspective towards orienting yourself toward the divine, that you grow as a person and that you can achieve really this transcendence. And it's you have to embrace the process as well, because it's not an instantaneous process. And I think from my personal experience as well, that if you do a lot of broad learning, and you also embrace the processes of life, the good and the bad, and in fact you don't avoid the bad, but in fact you also see the obstacles as an opportunity to grow stronger and wiser, then the long-term understanding and wisdom that you gain from this only grows. It amasses. To use the words of Nagarjuna, the Buddhist thinker, it's like an anthill. It amasses bit by bit over time. It's only small little fragments of earth, but eventually you get a massive mound over time. So going back to Plotinus, there is a pursuit of happiness. Happiness itself, as he understands it, is immutable and also eternal, absolute, but the whole process of getting there is a long journey. It is a long process. And this builds on the earlier chapters of, like, you start with mathematics, you start with music, you start with the appreciation of beauty, and then you try to extend that back to the concept of the idea of beauty, the form of beauty, and then trying to understand how this metaphysical reality is sort of operating at a level beyond material reality, to sort of detach yourself from the sort of constant grasping at material reality as an absolute, and also as a condition for one's own happiness. And this also reminds me a lot of the lessons that I've also learned from Buddhism as well. So this idea of grasping is constantly evoked in Buddhism. And one of the fundamental causes of suffering, according to Buddhism, is desire. And desire, specifically in the Buddhist context, kama, refers to grasping for sensory pleasures in particular. It doesn't mean, like, people misunderstand this and they think, well, is not desire for freedom from suffering, or desire for nirvana a desire that you have to get rid of? No, it means specifically desire for material things. And so if you orient your happiness, if you condition your happiness on material things, then it just won't work out in the long term, because these things are impermanent. And going back to what you said as well, the endorphin rushes will come and go. And if you're continually trying to inject these rushes into your system, then you'll just get exhausted and it just will stop working. So.
Right. And that kind of goes back to say one more thing before. I think we can kind of just move into the next small section, which I think really just is almost like a coda to this chapter. But when speaking, because he does think that we have the will is us pursuing those higher things. I had it written somewhere, but that basically, that is the will. It's not the reactions of the body. That's just the reactions of the body. So like your desire, you following like all these like mundane or material bodily desires, that's not actually you using your will. That's you just surrendering to like these bodily to your base needs that that really what's happening is hormonally, chemically, you're just a slave to your chemistry is what's happening fundamentally, and you're not asserting your intellectual will on controlling that or redirecting it. So yeah, totally different. Like just trying to pursue continuous endorphin highs, you're not actually in control. You're just submitting yourself to kind of badly wired chemistry, or like chemistry in your body that you've allowed to be wired a certain way, which is not very beneficial. He moves on to have a very short section in which he talks about, okay, now you have happiness.
Mm-hmm.
Does it increase with time? Does it remain the same? How does something that is temporal like time and something atemporal like happiness, how do those two things interact? And he thinks, I believe he doesn't think they interact.
Right. And then his comment, he said, being happy is found in a good life. It is clear that it should be located in the life of something that exists, for it is the best life. It should not therefore be counted by time, but by eternity. But this does not admit of the more nor less, nor does it have any extension, but rather it is non-dimensional and not temporal. So my understanding of that is it's cosmological in character, because the one is immutable absolute and not temporal, atemporal, outside of time. But he says that unhappiness can increase over time, but that's because unhappiness is also conditional upon material reality. So the physical form can decay over time, and you can experience increasing amounts of pain. You can have increasing damage to your reputation. And if you are conditioning your happiness on these sort of things, then the reverse reaction to that will only increase exponentially over time, especially just given the inevitable realities of life, which is decay.
Well, I think there's a caveat there. He does say something to the degree, something to the effect of, say you have some sort of malady. If that level of pain, let's say the level of pain remains the same, then your level of unhappiness really remains the same throughout. Just because you've had unhappiness yesterday and the day before that, and you will have it in the future, it's really the present that matters. But unlike happiness, the level of pain, the level of disaster in your life can always increase. Sometimes it doesn't, but it can. Therefore, the level of unhappiness can increase. It's not absolute, but it is a potential. Whereas the state of happiness, so the other thing is like his idea of true happiness and unhappiness are not diametrically opposed, because the state of unhappiness, I mean, there is a level of it where like you don't have true happiness, therefore all these things can happen. Therefore, when these things happen to you, you are susceptible to more and more unhappiness. But all these other things that can increase unhappiness are material. Happiness, being unmaterial, being in a higher realm, has no particulars. So there can't be there's no more or less of it, just like there can't be any more or less of the one or any other thing that lives in that realm, right? It is an absolute. So unlike unhappiness is not an absolute. I mean, I guess a baseline unhappiness, whether you're happy or you're not, but all those other things that are part of the material experience of unhappiness, since it is the lack of the higher realm, are particulars. Happiness is an absolute, which is why it is not affected by time and cannot be incremental, can't be added upon, right? I think that's like the crux of why that is.
Right. It doesn't increase or decrease because it's the good, it's the one, and the forms don't increase or decrease either.
Correct.
And when things are not things, but when you're viewing this intellectual realm, which is atemporal, and you're conditioning your mental state on it, then you're also orienting yourself toward eternity. And eternity here doesn't mean like endless time. It means actually being outside of time.
Right.
And so by virtue of that, your mental state, if it is truly oriented toward that perspective, is no longer subject to the ups and downs of normal material reality that we experience. But as you say, conversely, there's all these multitude of factors that can influence our unhappiness. So that's very optimistic. I mean, it's actually not very optimistic worldview as well, because he's suggesting that if we really master this perspective and if we embrace it, then we don't have really worries and apprehension and so forth. And this will inevitably lead to virtue. And this will inevitably lead to you being a more beneficial person for everybody else. So society also gains from this. And it's not that if you understand this, that you run off into the forest and nobody ever sees you again, and you just live as a hermit out in the wilderness. But rather conversely, you will probably positively engage in reality, but just with a very different state of mind, one that's not affected by...
Yeah, he says that. Virtue does not make one happy. Rather, happiness makes virtuous people.
Right. And so that's another interesting proposition as well, because some people, especially in the modern day, would suggest that like happiness is a byproduct of being a good person.
Yep, totally disagree. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was saying earlier. He posits quite the opposite, and I would think that he might be correct, given the level of not just unhappiness in the world, but the level of unvirtuous, or what's the correct term here, of non-virtue that we all see in the world. So I think a lot of people are not happy. To your point of his position actually being quite positive, another thing which it's kind of like, okay, so what? Cool. This is outside of you can't increase it. Thanks, Plotinus. Is there a more point to this? I think there is. I think there's more to him saying this than just making a wanting to specify something philosophically, just from a rational point of view. I think the message here is about the optimism and the hope that this can bring with a reader or anyone who might be interested in following this philosophy in life. Because if it can't increase at any point, one could come to read this or know of this philosophy and be like, I've spent most of my life very unhappy. I'm middle-aged and most of my life has been pretty shitty. I've been involved in this, that, and the other. Whereas like I'm behind, I haven't found happiness yet. And he says that doesn't matter how long and when in life you find happiness isn't the measure. It's not cumulative. It is or it isn't. It is in the present moment. So even if you are surrounded by people who you perceive to have, or very well may be truly happy and have been happy since birth or since they were like 20, they've figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
It should not demoralize one from trying to obtain happiness, because he says those people, even though they've been happy, it's not like them thinking back on like when they were happy 10, 15 years ago is actually making them more or less happy now. In fact, like unhappy people, yes, and you can fall, correct. It doesn't compound. And you can also fall out of happiness, it sounds like. He says you can stop being happy. So you either are or you're not. And thinking about past happiness doesn't make you happy, just much like someone who perhaps was happy or believed they were happy in the past and are currently unhappy. Thinking about those happy moments, I think there's a quote, I don't remember by who, but it's actually like, maybe it's Proust, but I'm not sure, that like one of the worst feelings is actually remembering a period of happiness in life when you are presently unhappy. So clearly, length or memory of past happiness isn't making you happier. So just focus on getting to being happy. And all that matters is the present day, the present moment. Are you happy now? Good. Then you have no more or less happiness than the guy who apparently has been happy for 20 years. Because in the present, he is only as happy as he can be in the present, right? So I think it's very optimistic. I think that is, from a more human point of view, the point of this little section. It's not just him crossing T's and dotting I's on the dynamics of his cosmology. It's the hope that's there for people who are not happy, that you
Right.
could find happiness in the last 10 years of your life. And I've known people like that. And they are not, crying about, I mean, like, yeah, it would have been great if I'd found this earlier in life, but they're not there, being miserable about not having been happy all the rest, because they're happy.
Right.
Right.
Right. But I think Plotinus's idea too, he would have to suggest to people that you first have to define the parameters of happiness.
Which he did.
Which he did. But I think but
Right.
as we've said, like there's mundane happiness, which is what is common today, where people say like,
right. Well, obviously this is in the dynamic, like you have to have understood the previous concept of
yes,
happiness, and everything I am saying is within that specific definition of happiness. Even though I think some of this is applicable to even like other things that are approaching happiness, or just like maybe more or less healthier mental states one can be in. I think it's applicable, and though some of that is applicable there too, right? Just because you're not mentally healthy, or you haven't been like economically and mentally, socially stable for most of your life, does not mean that if you reach that place and have more equilibrium, which is still at least a good starting place to go toward happiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that is not worth as much as someone who has had mental stability and emotional equilibrium for 30 years, because both of you, regardless, are only living in the present. Mm-hmm. But yes, this whole idea of the time not affecting happiness is very specific to his definition of happiness. Though I think, for people, everyone's starting where they're starting. Not everyone is like in a state of Neoplatonic happiness. You kind of, it's a journey.
One final thought I had reading this too was an experience I had in Japan, where a friend said that they were very unhappy in their present job because they were working 7 days a week with no vacation time. And I said, well, if you're that unhappy, why don't you look into finding a new job? And they said, you Americans always talk about happiness. You can't be happy all the time. And it struck me, and I thought about that for a long time, about what they really meant by that. And I realized that in the Japanese language and in the Japanese culture, in my experience and observations, this idea of the pursuit of happiness is not as strongly pronounced as it is in the West. And I think that's because fundamentally the West is very much influenced by this Greek intellectual tradition of happiness, like Aristotle, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Platonists. Everybody talks about, well, what is happiness and how can we achieve it? Whereas in the Japanese cultural framework, which is heavily influenced by Buddhism, there's an expectation that there will be the good times and the bad times, they come and go, and that you just have to experience both. And the idea that
was he or she complaining about their job, or were they just stating a fact that their job did not make them happy? They're the ones who brought it up.
No, they didn't frame it as being unhappy, but rather they said like, I'm really exhausted. And in the Japanese language, you wouldn't use like, you wouldn't say like, shigoto de ureshiku nai, I'm unhappy at the job. Like you can say that, but it would be the adjective you would use would probably be like, it's very difficult, it's bitter, it's tiresome. But this framing it using adjectives or nouns such as happiness or happy wouldn't be there. And I realized that this pursuit of happiness and this obsession we have with the question of happiness stems from this Greek intellectual tradition, which is not universal across all human cultures.
No, not even in the West necessarily to the same degrees everywhere. Because I was just thinking when you brought this up, like the difference from Italian to English. I'm curious. I would be curious to know what the Germanic or Norse, I'm not sure what the etymology of the word happiness in English actually is and where it comes from. But like in Italian, the equivalent of like, and this is also true with the word love in English actually, but sticking to happiness, it's like, there is no in between. Like, it's like the equivalent of like ecstatic joy, or it can be just, what do you mean by happy? Since the higher end of the definition of the spectrum seems to be what people keep on harping on. But in Italian, you can say sono contento, which in English is the root for from Latin, content. I'm content. Whereas the term that in English would be happiness, in Italian would be felicità or gioia, like joy. It's like in English, people are constantly searching to be in a state of joy or ecstasy almost. Whereas to be contento is good. It's like it's something sustainable day to day. Like I'm happy. I'm contento. I'm happy. But like happy is a lot. It's a very loaded term, and I think the word it's interesting to contemplate the chicken and the egg when it comes to words that we use. How much words, the words we choose in a specific language form then our relationship with the meaning of that word, versus the other way around, versus the thing informing the word itself. And like the word happiness having such a more amped definition, or so it appears, than in other languages, and being so like not a gradient. It's just like there's like less gradient terms. There's not, I guess you could say content, but when you say content in English, it almost has like a negative, not a negative connotation, but kind of it almost, people think that you're like settling.
There's almost an apathy there. An apathy is implied. Yeah.
Which in Italian, which in the word contento in Italian does not have at all.
Right.
It's actually, like, to me at least, it has like a sense of more like being serene, being in a serene, stable state in your life.
Right. And this is the importance of words, and it also just demonstrates how our own vocabulary constructs our mental state,
our reality.
It constructs our reality. The words do. I mean, you really get this. You really understand this when you study ancient languages, and you realize that the sort of subjective concepts and the way that they conceived of social relationships and life and so forth was very, very different. And even when you study modern languages, like there's concepts, for example, in the Japanese language that, like, there's grammatical concepts that just do not exist in English. And you can sort of translate it, but the actual sense of it is still very different. But for a Japanese speaker, there's a sort of experience in that little part of the language that English speakers just don't have. And I mean, probably, and vice versa as well. But it's just that language constructs our reality.
Yes, all the linguists in the audience. Yeah, all the linguists in the audience are jumping up and down and saying, yes, of course, and probably have a million other things to add to that. Well, I feel a little happier after. I was a little cranky, actually, earlier in the day. I feel a little happier, maybe because I've been contemplating loftier things than the oppressive heat where I'm living.
Right.
That is influencing me physically, and I have no control over.
Right. That's a lesson I've taken as well, is that like there's like physiological unhappiness, if we call it unhappiness.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily have to affect your sense of judgment and well-being. Like you can still be content and mentally well in the face of, physiological fatigue and stress and illness. But it's also being able to divide that, where like for example, when I was doing my meditation retreat in the Himalayas, there were some days that I felt absolutely depressed. But I realized that, well, I'm actually doing okay, but it's the altitude that's making me feel depressed. Yes. But I realized, so there's a physiological depression that's affecting me, which is a result of the altitude, because I was staying at a pretty high altitude for several months, and it was starting to really affect me. But it was a lesson I took away, that my mental state, like my fundamental mental state, wasn't the cause of this, that there was nothing emotional going on inside of me. There was no experience internally or externally that really was subjectively causing this. It was just a physiological response. So I didn't have to, assent to it. I didn't have to, engage that depression and try to formulate a narrative as to why I was feeling depressed and frame it in some sort of emotional way. It was just basically a physiological response to the environment.
So you have now discovered what every other female person listening to this audience knows happens, if not on a monthly basis, more often. That that you do feel the feelings you are feeling, but there may, if you actually, as a woman myself, I have like started as actually, this is kind of a interesting topic for the women in the audience, young or old. I'm sure as most women get older, I think they start, because if you become more aware of when certain things are happening during your cycle and the uncontrollable physiological hormonal effects it actually does have on your serotonin, on your endorphins, pain thresholds. But often, like, you forget that it's because of that, and you just think you're having a bad day and you're just feeling emotional and you don't even. But when you start actually like tracking your cycle or paying attention, at least myself, and I feel like plenty of other women who, are trying to gain control in their life, have noticed that once they remember to track these things and just make a note that when they feel that way, it's like, oh yes, I'm at this point in my cycle. Very quickly, it becomes so much easier to manage because you differentiate and you're like, oh, this is just a physiological, it's still not fun, but you're able to be like, oh, it's not actually because of all these other things nothing's happening. I'm actually okay. I understand why I'm feeling this way, and it makes the whole experience a whole lot more manageable, and the level of mental suffering is much lower, at least in my experience. Obviously, everyone's going through things at different levels, and people have different dysfunctions when it comes to that. But even in something that seems as mundane and like very down to earth as that differentiation, especially for like over half of the population, is an important thing to think about, that kind of mindfulness in trying to keep a mental stability in our approach toward happiness.
Good. That's a very good lesson to take away. Thank you for that. And I think that's a good note to end on. Very optimistic and positive one. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.